Hi, I'm Rosie Finn, astrologer in Olympia, Washington, and I want to talk about Uranus moving into Gemini today. Now, I know a lot of people have been talking about this and its connection to World War II, which was the last time that Uranus went into Gemini, and then the time before that was the Civil War. So it's easy if you just go back a couple of times to associate Uranus moving into Gemini with war. But I want to take away that notion through looking a little bit deeper historically and by flowing in Neptune into Aries and Pluto out of bounds into the bigger picture of what's happening. But first, let's just talk about Gemini and Uranus. So Uranus is this planet that's about awakening. It's a planet that kind of shocks us into life. It's a planet that creates quick change, and it opens doorways, and it can open portals. It can open portals in our brain because it rules the nervous system and parts of the brain. It can open portals in terms of power and energy because it's one of the rulers of energy. It rules electricity. It rules technology. It's always there. We always have to deal with Uranus. Gemini is the sign of communication. It's the sign of connection. It's the sign of intellectual curiosity. Now, on one vibrational level, a normal, we'll say mundane, normal life, Gemini is ruled by Mercury, and Mercury is the intellect, it's our brain, it's our thoughts, it's all the kind of neural networks that are going on. And Mercury is a bit about magic. Mercury is the ruler of Gemini, though, keeps the brain firing over and over again. The so Mercury is the ruler of Gemini, creates that scattered, curious, but overly mental energy that we often associate with Gemini. But the spiritual ruler of Gemini is Venus. Venus unites the twins, it unites the energy, it grounds the communication, it brings in this vibration of love and creativity. So now Uranus in Gemini is in Venus's spiritual sign. And Uranus and Venus are the planets that are most deeply connected with the seventh ray, which is this ray, which is a portal energy that's opening up our crown chakras. And it's opening up our crown chakras through the sign of Libra, through Venus, through Uranus. And these things are moving us into things that are associated with the Aquarian age, things that are associated with moving out of the Kali Yuga into a more enlightened, awakened time. And usually in these transitions, which I'm talking bigger transitions, I'm talking about the beginning of the Aquarian age, a 2000-year time period that we're moving towards, the end of the Kali Yuga, which is thousands of years, the end of the precessional cycle, not the end of it, but the shift that's happening around the alignments around the galactic center. These are big cycles. And right now, when we're moving into out of one yuga into another, out of one age into another age, it's often very messy, it's often very chaotic. There's tremendous amount of unknown and uncertainty. And Uranus is the planet that connects us into our nervous system, is the planet that can push us into overwhelm. And Gemini is a sign that kind of thrives in overwhelm, except that it really wants to be united. It really wants to bring in deep, loving communication. So when Uranus is in Gemini, we're looking for Venus activation points. And in the fall, Venus goes retrograde. It'll go retrograde in Scorpio, and then it'll go back into Libra, and it'll station at the star Arcturus and the star Spica. And this is a brilliant place for Venus to station in its own sign of Libra. It's where it gets to really open up these higher consciousnesses, these portals into these new ways of communicating and being. So Uranus into Gemini is going to be opened up in the fall. In Vedic astrology, the outer planets are usually not considered, even though they were known to exist before even scientists found them in their telescopes. But they don't usually use Uranus. The Venus retrograde in the fall for Vedic astrologers is also really significant because when it starts its journey into retrograde, it will be in its own sign, and it will be in its own sign for most of the fall, except for 3 weeks, the first 3 weeks of November, where it dips back into Virgo. So this strengthens Venus. So there's a Venus activation when we look at it from Western or when we look at it from Vedic. And I get particularly interested when I see the two systems sync up. All right, so let's go back to Uranus and Gemini. It dipped into Gemini last spring, and now it will be there for the next 7 years. And Uranus and Gemini is associated with new technologies, particularly new communication technologies. So let's go back in historically and look at the past. Okay, most of you are familiar with this chart. It's woven throughout my book, Persephone's Revolution. Has to do with Pluto. So let's go into a background state about Pluto. Pluto goes out of bounds twice every 248 years. And when it goes out of bounds to the north up here during a power time or to the south in reform. What we're moving into now, 2025 to 2035, is Pluto out of bounds to the south. So moving into a reform time. The vision times are when Pluto crosses 0 degrees declination south to north. That's the vision time. That's the beginning of a Pluto cycle. That's when we see these great visionaries. Those great visionaries are often paid for, supported by the elite. The elite use these new ideas that the visionaries share to amass more power. They amass more power during the power time period. During the justice time period, there starts to be the whistleblowers and people coming out saying, look, something's wrong here. There's deep corruption. Those people usually get killed or are forced underground or are forced to do things that they would probably not wish to do. Sometimes these get violent, these justice time periods. And then we go to the reform time, which is when we all wake up. We all see that the emperor has no clothes. We see the injustices that are happening, and we, as people, as humanity, amass power. So we lose power during power time as people, and then we gain it back during the reform time, and then we go through the cycle again. Since there's a certain degree of violence and acceptability of war that is indoctrinated in the culture for thousands of years, we're going to see war pretty much at all of these stages at different times in history. But let's look at how the Pluto cycle interweaves with Neptune moving into Aries. Now, Neptune moving into Aries, and these blue are the times that Neptune moved into Aries. So Neptune is the planet of visions, of dreams, of spirituality. Aries is a sign of initiation. So there's a new path forward for Neptune, particularly as it moves over the world access point at 0 degrees Aries, which happened in February, and we're still a little bit in the orb of that. But Neptune into Aries is a time of beginning new thoughts around our spirit, understanding new ways of being, of dreaming, of envisioning. There's new ideals that come in. So we look at the Neptune in Aries as an initiation time period, and Uranus moving into Gemini as a time of technology. Pluto going out of bounds has a lot to do with power and how power is flowing through people and systems. So I'm not going to go through all of these. I've done this a bit in my book, but I want you to note that Neptune moves into Aries when Pluto is either out of bounds to the south, reform, out of bounds to the north, power, or at a vision time. And then it goes back to reform, power, vision, reform. Each of these cycles is colored by where Neptune goes into Aries. Neptune goes into Aries here, 715. This is the building of the Islamic empires, the Umayyad Caliphates. The Abbasids. This is the Tang dynasty. We see Neptune moving into Aries at a vision time period during this cycle, which is medieval times in Europe, but this is a major renaissance that's happening in Arabia and in Persia. It's also really the beginning of the British. This is Alfred the Great, and this is the Battle of Hastings. So in this slide, I start weaving into Uranus, moving into Gemini, and you can see these dates are not exactly lining up. One of the things I like to look for is when things start moving into deeper and deeper synchronicity. So this is a little bit off Neptune and Aries. Because Neptune goes around the sun 3 times for every Pluto's 2 times, and that harmonic between them two is extremely accurate. So this is why Neptune moves into Aries precisely at the peak of Pluto out of balance to the south, or the peak at Pluto out of balance to the north. It continues to do that with a great deal of synchronicity. Uranus goes around every 2 times for Neptune's 1 time, but it's not quite as precise. So Uranus kind of moves around here. But let's go to this slide because I'll just dive into these 3 cycles. 1373 is the beginning of the Italian Renaissance. This is the time period of Petrarch and Boccaccio. It's also the time of John Wycliffe, who is starting to talk about the corruption in the Catholic Church. He teaches Chaucer, and Chaucer writes these epic poems. He's probably met Boccaccio in around 1373 when he went to Florence and spent some time there. Boccaccio and Petrarch were old men living near Florence. He would have at least read his work because Canterbury Tales is very similar to Boccaccio's work. But there is a sense in both Italy and England that the language is shifting. In 1355, this is just a couple of years after the Black Plague. The Black Plague is 1348. And it's a 3-4 year time period that really devastates Europe. And it spreads and it erupts again and again. But that Black Death time period that Monty Python portrays and you hear about is 1348, roughly around there. And then Dante writes his great works right after that. And so around this time period, Uranus and Gemini is presenting language. It's the evolution of both Italian and English. I don't know what's going on with France or other cultures, but I know these two, Dante and Chaucer, are legendary. So when we get to Uranus goes into Gemini the next time, 1439, this is a really significant time in terms of technology around communication because this is Gutenberg printing the first Bible. And the printing press had been developed in China centuries before, but in this time period, Gutenberg invents his own printing press and prints a Bible. And between this Uranus and Gemini and this Uranus and Gemini, what radically shifts in Europe is literacy, because now people have access to books, so people are reading. It's just off the charts what it goes from, I think, 10% to 90%. I'm just making that up, but it's something mind-blowing like that. So when we get down here, 1523, this is 4 years after Martin Luther has pinned the theses to a church door, but really it was pamphlets that he was spreading. And and because people were literate, they could understand it and they could see, why can't I read the Bible? Why can't I? There's this empowerment that happens. And during this time period, you get to 1534, this is the bulk of the Reformation. This is when Henry VIII is kicking the Catholic Church out of England. This is the Holy Roman Empire actually moving towards Protestantism or the protest movements. So we have a major protest movement. Now, this cycle, Neptune is at vision and reform. That's mirroring our current cycle a lot better than this cycle that happened right before us, 1619 to 1863. So as we're looking at the Italian Renaissance and we're looking at the Reformation, this is a very good model for what we're in right now. So I want us to think about this moment that we're in right now has similar to Martin Luther and the eruption of the shift in the way people thought and in the power structures that happened during the Reformation. Now, there's a lot going on in the New World. The 1496 might look familiar to many of you. It's the time of Columbus and Ferdinand and Isabella. And there's a lot going on here in terms of this is the time of Savonarola, and there starts to be like this massive corruption in the Catholic Church that's really kicking in through the Borgia Pope Alexander the Sixth, and there's a shift in power that's happening at this time period also because Spain has really amassed quite a bit of power in this cycle, and they have amassed this empire, and they're getting very greedy in this time period with what's coming in from their voyages to the new worlds, and they're decimating the Inca Empire and the Aztec Empire, which also synchronistically really blossomed, came out of the woodworks around the 1350s, 1370s in this time period. And this is the amassment of power in the Inca and Aztec empires. So the fall of those empires are happening here as the conquistadors are taking over in the 1500s. But they're also not really benefiting Spain because Spain massively falls towards the end of the cycle. 1588 is the Spanish Armada. They go to attack England, and England really moves into power at this time period. The end of this cycle is Elizabeth I. And at this time period, this is really the beginning of the East India Trading Company. So the beginning of this kind of corporate colonization. So this cycle is all about colonization, and this is about the massment of power in the British Empire. We see Neptune moving into Aries, having this initiation. All right, let's talk technology. 1523, this is the Reformation. 1606, this vision time period, talk about Uranus moving into Gemini, about communication. This is the time of Galileo, of Kepler, of the telescope and the microscope. These two inventions changed the world. And there are two, they make glasses in the Netherlands. I think they live a block apart. One does the microscope and the other does the telescope. And Galileo gets his hands on a telescope. He sees the moons. He starts talking about Copernicus's work, which happened down here, Neptune in Aries, Uranus in Gemini time period. But Copernicus doesn't share his work, and Copernicus bases it on the work of Al-Battani, who lived centuries before, and I think Al-Battani was Persian, but anyway, in the Islamic Empire region. So 1619 in this cycle, we've got Uranus. This is Kepler's work about planetary motion is really the foundational work to Newton. And 1690, this is the time of Isaac Newton and Boyle's laws about gases. And those laws of gravitation and gases, they start a slew of inventions using gas and steam. And I think Boyle's laws may have had a bigger impact on technology back then. When we get to 1774, now we have the beginning of the Industrial Revolution because there's all these improvements based on the steam engine that was developed in the 1700s or early 1700s. Now we have a steam engine that's usable. We have the cotton gin. We have a bunch of inventions that are happening down here. Now, Pluto's out of bounds to the south, so it's revolutionary. And Neptune is in having the awakening moment of moving into Aries. That happened back here when the actual formulas were developed. So we have this Uranus and Gemini moving technology along pretty significantly. Then we get to 1858 and Neptune into Aries. So these two are syncing up 2 years apart, right when Pluto's at the vision point. This is a lot of synchronicity, and this is a huge time in terms of technology. One of the most important things that happened technologically at this time period was James Clerk Maxwell developed the equations for electricity and magnetism. There's no more equations that are more significant that we have. All of our technology is based on it, all nuclear energy, all of that. We wouldn't have computers, we wouldn't have any of this without Maxwell's equations. The Maxwell related magnetism and electricity. And there are ways to work with Maxwell's equations. So the ways that the capitalists, which this is the robber baron time, and this is the beginning of oil and using oil for power, and Rockefeller starting his empire to figure out ways to manipulate power sources using oil. What happens here is that they use Maxwell's equation to focus on the aspects of it that have to do with electricity, which can be monitored and controlled, but magnetism cannot be. So in between 60, in the Edison is starting his empire in this time period, and then Nikola Tesla works for him for a bit. Tesla dies right during World War II in New York, but he's trying to get us to use magnetism. He's trying to work with free energy devices. But during this time period in the cycle, Pluto is gaining power. The plutocrats are gaining power. The elite is gaining power. So Tesla's work fails. Uranus in Gemini here, 1941, this is the beginning of the computer. This is the beginning of Turing's work. And it's done during World War II, which means that it's done at this power time period, and the computer and the technology industry is used to amass power for the elite. So now here we are. Uranus in Gemini, 2026, but Neptune is here, and they are extremely close. Pluto is out of bounds to the south. That means that we're getting our power back. We're reclaiming our power. And Uranus is opening gateways for new ways of technology, and Neptune is initiating things. The work of AI, so 1987, this is the time of the internet really taking off. The work of AI is, it's not actually new technology. It's using all of this technology from the 1860s onward to amass more and more power. Something else is happening here. This is brand new technology. This is going to be an awakening similar to the Reformation. A little bit of a hint of the Industrial Revolution, but with Neptune in Aries, it's more like, boom, wow, the power structures need to shift. We can change this. We can do things really differently. So that's what we're moving into. And I want us to really presence that the new ways of communicating can be telepathy and things that we've been working on since the 1860s in particular, because that was a time of mesmer and hypnotherapy, and it was a time of homeopathy coming out and naturopathy and lots of different healing tools, and also psychology and our understanding of how we connect and relate to each other. All of these things were really had their birthing moments back in the 1860s and are now coming out. They're popular. There's no shaming anymore about them. There's a sense that we are collectively healing our trauma. We are working with nonviolent communication, which can lead into deeper and deeper forms of communication, particularly when Venus goes retrograde in the fall, which I have a lot of hope for because I think it's an extraordinary combination of things that are happening starting right away in September. So let's embrace and welcome in Uranus into Gemini. Let's honor the energy of Venus, which brings in all kinds of creative artistic expression. I think there's going to be just this wild energy of creativity that kind of bursts through in the fall. As we're looking at Pluto out of bounds, it's back in bounds now. The power elites are doing everything they can. They're just pulling out all the stops to create and amass and hold on to the things that they got during World War II. So they are trying with everything they have to hold on. It's not going to work. I don't know how we're going to do this, but we're going to. The energy is just so present and is so moving through us, in us, opening us. And that is going to happen more and more, particularly as we get into September. All right. Peace, everyone. I hope you're all doing well.